Alright, so still here on the passenger side. Our next bolt up in the bell housing is going to be a 14mm socket. Okay, so just put in the bolt above the guide bolt. It's the first transmission bell housing bolt. It's 14 for the nut and 14 for the bolt. I had to use an extension to be able to use the torque wrench on it and get it from down here. And the manual says to torque it to between 22 and 26 foot-pounds, so we've torqued it to 24 foot-pounds. And I don't think anything attaches to that bolt. There is another bolt higher. If you're dealing with the four-wheel drive version of the vehicle, there's going to be a vent that needs to go in. It needs to attach to that bolt as well. It's a small vent with a tube that goes over to the transfer case. In this two-wheel drive version of the vehicle, that vent doesn't exist. But we do have the dipstick tube, which is going to need to connect on the other side to the other bolt. So we want to make sure that we don't forget to put the dipstick tube back in before we put the other housing bolts on. I'm going to go over to the driver's side again and work on this same bolt, but it's going to be reversed with the nut on the rear instead of on the engine side. Okay, looking good. So on this side, things are going to go backwards from the passenger side. I'll go ahead and reach up above the ear that comes out of the engine and find this hole up here in the plate that goes between the transmission and the engine. Just going to go ahead and push this bolt through it, and it should come out the back of the transmission bell housing. And then we're going to take our nut and our ratcheting wrench, make sure we're going the right direction. And then let's go ahead and see if I can change the lighting a little bit for you guys. Alright, so we're working on this bolt up here. Not a lot to look at from that angle, I'm sure. I can show it to you in a second here. See how far I can get it finger tight. Seems pretty far. Okay. So that's the The nut is on the rear on the driver's side. And we get up there with my wrench. And put it on the front probably, so I can get on this other side torque converter. So I can get on the other side with the torque wrench. Alright, so here's my torque wrench. Gonna reach up there. Again, they're both 14mm. and that bolt is torqued. So you can get this free. If not, we'll just have to leave it there forever. Alright. So now we need to put the dipstick tube back in to make sure that it's not going to get stuck in any way. So we can do that from the top and on the passenger side. Okay, so here's our dipstick tube. It's been cleaned off some. And this one does not have an O-ring. Then we're going to come over here to the engine bay where it ends up and just thread it down and toward the transmission. You basically need to snake it into place. First it's going to be at the wrong angle. There's a little ear on it that's going to attach to one of our housing bolts, and we need to flip it over so that that ear is in the right orientation before it can't happen. This part can take a little bit of patience. It's like a puzzle. You don't want to break the exhaust or any of the cables or any of this other stuff that's kind of in your way. Just get it down in there and imagine it headed towards its final location. So then we're going to come back over here and get the light on everything and take a look at how it's doing. So if you reach up over the transmission, you should be able to feel the dipstick. In this case I can see it right here. We want it on the other side of both the linkage and the electrical connector there, so you can see the end of it hanging out. Okay, and your first move is just to take the dipstick tube, making sure it still feels relatively free, and then find its way down into the brand new rubberized connector that you put in when you rebuilt the transmission. Push down on it until you see it's fully seated in there. Okay, so that's the dipstick tube put back in step one. And then the last two bell housing bolts can go in the top of the transmission, one of which holds the dipstick tube in place. Alright, so I'm over here on the driver's side of the engine, and I'm just working on feel at this point. But I'm going to reach up and feel where the dipstick tube little ear is, and that hole should already, if it's been pushed down correctly, line me right up with where this bolt needs to go in the bell housing and eventually into the engine. So I'm just going to twist that by hand as far as I can, and you may want to shove the dipstick tube towards the engine so that it doesn't get in your way. Now I can take a small hand wrench to this bolt and get it most of the way. If I want to torque it, I'm going to need to do it from the rear of the engine, so I'm going to go get some extensions so I can show you how to do that. Okay, so here we are at the rear of the transmission, and you can see the bolt up there that's connecting the dipstick tube. That's one of our 4 bolts that is for the bell housing. On this one, that dipstick tube should pretty much be the only thing that we need to make sure we're not forgetting to attach when we attach the 4 bell housing bolts. So So I've got quite a few extensions here. I've got a long extension designed for exhaust, and I've got a wobbly. I'm going to put my wobbly on the end so that I can get a little bit of bend up there. And then I'm going to put another one on the back just so I can get far enough. And so I'm pushing all the way up there until I can get it seated on the bolt. And there I am, seated on the bolt. Now I'm going to take first my regular wrench and tighten that a little bit. As it starts to get snug, I'm going to take my torque wrench and go ahead and keep going. And we're going again to 24 foot-pounds. Our manual says 22 to 26 foot-pounds. Alright. So there's that bolt started. Now I'm going to grab the bolt that goes on the other side. You can see the hole there above the dipstick tube on the passenger side. So coming back around, I'm pretty much seated under the car right now. I've got it really high on the jack stands and able to, in order to do what I'm doing right now. I can edit this later for all my super long, dumb sounding pauses. I'll figure out what I'm saying to you guys while I'm doing it. Okay, get that on there. And then starting with our regular wrench. And once you get close, go ahead and switch over to the torque wrench. Anyway, you get the idea. Just turn it until you hear your torque wrench click. And then you'll know that all four of the transmission bell housing bolts are installed correctly. Okay, so now that we have our transmission bell housing bolts and our torque converter bolts in place, I'm going to go ahead and break this strap over the transmission jack. Transmission jack itself is still pretty essential, so if you've noticed it's gotten slack, you want to make sure that it's tight. But we do need to get the strap out of our way while we attach our linkage and while we attach our transmission cooler lines. So I'm going to need something to cut the zip tie here. Okay, so now that we have our 4 bolts on the housing installed, we're going to want to install our crank position sensor. So there's a hole here that it goes into in the bell housing, and then there's a hole here that the bolt attaches to. So I need to look around a little bit, figure out where it's gotten to. So it's probably hanging on the passenger side if I had to guess. I'm going to move over there and see if I can find There is my throttle position sensor. And I want to take it. I do want it to wire on the other side of this piece of linkage. I'm going to pull the linkage forward for now. And you can see the hole in the bell housing. The throttle position sensor sticks down into it like so. And this is an 11mm bolt. Some of them are adjustable and hard to line up. In this particular case, it only fits in one way. I can help you. And don't overdo this one. It's not holding any weight. It's just holding the sensor so it can see the windows on the flex plate. Just make it snug, and that's good enough. Our next item on the menu here is to install the inspection plate. And the manual says that we want to tighten it to between 96 and 180 inch-pounds. So that's a pretty wide range. I'm going to go for the middle at 142 inch-pounds. I've got my inch-pound torque wrench set up to do this. So I'm going to get this little piece of the exhaust up where it won't get in my way too much. So I want to orient it like so. It's a piece of the plate that goes behind the other plate here. Try to be patient with yourself and figuring out which way it goes. These dents go on the outside, and there's a couple of tabs. Tabs go on the outside. If either of these plates has gotten bent, this process gets a little bit harder. Alright, so these bolts here in the inspection plate are either 1/2 inch or 13mm. They're so close that either one should work. Easily get the torque wrench on this top one. And torque it to 142 inch-pounds. These other two are not quite as easy. My apologies if you only work in Newton meters. Because it's an aluminum case, snug is probably good enough on these bolts. Alright. And I'm going to stop there for now. Next we're going to work on installing the starter. Alright, so our next step is going to be install the starter motor. So I've got it tied up here. It's disconnected at the top in this case. I just left the wires connected. And let me get this piece of tie line out of here. It's okay, kitty. You're okay. And we just need to get it in there and set up with the torque converter and the flex plate. So this back bolt here that comes through the transmission bell housing is a 15 millimeter. Bendy, you're okay. And this other bolt that goes in through the front here is a 14 millimeter. Alright, so that 14 went pretty much all the way in by hand. 15's making it about halfway. So these just need to be tight. They don't need to be crazy. It's aluminum. Should stop exactly where you need it. And I love you, Katie. Shh. Alright, so that's the starter installed. Next we're going to work on the linkage. Okay, so we have two trans cooler lines, and we have the linkage. There's our linkage. Alright, so now we're going to start reattaching the linkage. This piece of the linkage right here is the main throttle. It's the main shift control. So there is a bolt that goes into the transmission down here. And it is a 3/8 socket. Start that bolt right there. Holds the bottom of that bracket. Get it most of the way tight. And put my wrench on it. And then I have an 11/16 nut that goes on this part of the linkage. This threaded piece is attached to the bracket permanently. The stud just hangs down. And again, I said it's an 11/16. You might be able to fit a 17 on there, but most likely it'll be really snug. Then I just need to flip this around until the flat spot fits onto the flat spot in the shifter. If the transmission is back in park and the car was in park when we stopped, they should match right up like that. Show you guys a little closer. Is it installed? And then we're just going to get in there with the 13 millimeter wrench and tighten it. Make sure we're going the right direction here. The other side is square, so you shouldn't have to hold on to it. Just make sure you pushed it all the way down flat. A 1/2 inch will work for this too. Don't go crazy, just get it nice and snug so it's got a good connection. Alright, so next we're going to add this piece of the kickdown linkage. It only fits onto the smaller D-shaped piece of metal one way, but it needs to go through it twice. So in pushing it down, You want to take a look at it and put the flat side with the flat side. Sometimes this can take some patience just to get in the right location because the bottom part is round. It's only the top section that has the metal cut out in a D shape. I usually end up taking it on and off a few times. This is the kick down lever. We're going to end up eventually connecting the kick down lever with this spring right here that will attach to the transmission up here. Often it's easier to put the spring on before you go to pull it into position. Don't be sad, Bindi. I'm almost done. Don't be sad. Okay, so once it's pushed down onto both levels, you should just barely be able to feel the metal coming through the top. And it should rock back and forth without coming off. Should be able to move it like so. Should pop back into position. Alright, once we've got that, we want to take an 11mm socket and tighten it into position. $11mm socket. Seems to be what fit in this case. Let's get that kick down adjustment nice and snug so it won't come off. You can always check it, make sure it's moving. Okay, last but not least, this cable needs to come around, and you're going to need a 14mm socket again. First part is to connect the bolt to this bracket that holds it. Make sure you get it all the way seated. Hello, Mr. Moth. Goodness. Okay. So, then, to get it most of the way, we'll go ahead and get a 14mm socket and twist it into place. Super cute little moth here visiting me because he likes the light. Yes, I know. I know. You like the light, yes. Alright, so 14mm, just tighten that guy up. And then this part right here pops onto the top of the kick down. Just push straight down, it should pop in place. And then this part slides back to cover the cable. If you notice the part that you just tightened is not quite in line, it's good to loosen it back up again and tilt the back of it towards the passenger side of the vehicle, and then realign it so that this cable's little sleeve is perfectly straight. Alright, so that's our linkage reinstalled. It's the little sleeve I was talking about. Just make sure it snaps all the way into place. And then the whole kick down should move on the spring. Alright, next we're going to reinstall all the electrical connectors that go to the transmission. So I've got, first of all, this one on the top right here. Should push down until it clicks. Some of them won't click
but if it will, try to get it all the way down. And then there should be a connector shaped like a disc that goes to your park neutral safety switch. Just be sure it's pushed all the way on. Then there is a connector here. It's got 2 pins in it. And a connector back here for the speed sensor that has 3 pins in it. There's also a little clip, plastic clip, that clips onto the top of the transmission to hold the wiring harness in place. Okay, so that's our wiring harness.
Here's our 2 cooler lines. I zip tied them out of the way just to make things a little bit easier. You can see also that the 2 lines clip together with one another. This little clip that holds them together though is a good idea to have installed. This gives them a little bit more rigidity. Okay, this rear one has this little clip that holds it in place. This was not the easiest thing to find. I ended up getting this one from O'Reilly's. Often they become brittle over time and can break.
And then our last move is going to be to line up our cooler lines and to get them into place you may need to pass them behind the exhaust. That's something I'm going to have to take a look at. Whether they go behind the exhaust or in front of it. I'm pretty sure they go behind it. So the front cooler line in this case should screw into place. And the rear cooler line should just pop into place. I'm going to disconnect them from this little bracket that holds them together so that I can move them independently. For the one that screws into place, you want to push the tube away from the vehicle to the back of the bracket you're turning. And then for the one that clips into place, you just want to patiently rock it back and forth and push it in there until it clicks. For the front one, once I get it all the way finger tight, I'm gonna go get a wrench to hit it with.
Alright, so to remove this front cooler line, I've wedged a 16mm onto the back connector that comes out of the transmission, and then we're going to use a 19mm wrench on the actual connector here that's attached permanently to the cooler line, and we just want to leave that 16mm wrench in place.
Yeah, when they have a connection at skill, I want to stay there for like stay there. Carrots that night. Okay, but they're playing a good with her and so I was getting like else and that's low. It helps here for serious. Yeah. That's when you don't want to lay up down. Weeks, ready. Yeah, we'll sit down to the size being on me. Let's see. Simmons, they won't see that. And I repeat every week. I nothing if it was your feet, let's all on else in that. Self, I don't have full size. Gosh, I'm not like here, feet, we seven yoke, size, the old south, seven resting. Oh, no, yeah. Scan. No, we do that. I remember I was camera but I do down. Nice, we do this a lot, right? Not yours, and tonight, you know, it's my yesterday. Snap, it's fine, real lucky. But the over doesn't have, I was. Oh, you Scott, but I'm the first dude, 5 minutes. Yeah, I'm really, I'm the first dude, 5 minutes. But the rest of that. So long here, if it's always the left area, we lost it. Harry here, what's always be the kind of close to that second? Come on, there's all the beers for us. So I was good, the kind of say that. I'm missions next to the arrow. Who's not drill? One's there. That's the opposite, make your skims. Oh, but now you're even not cap and open cap, oh, but no kind of scam. Yeah, we're over there. Yeah, that's no water myself, but the most you was. I'm suckers in that. Snowball up. No, I'm not gonna steal what do we need. No shame's next to the flat. It's old but sure. Nah. Heard myself a lot and I had open open what's it. Oh, he's doing what on. And really millimeters the arms are the stair. I'll see how those in there from the person myself. That's a fun X there. You're finding out from the sausages. Just how we're in the city to connect. It's kind of some. Heard the other egg and next to I'm looking there. Alright, well, so guess use that and that. Right there, I'm the shrimps next to that. So with the snake up out, and again also, and boom, or it's the next snare with the off must. So the tab, the next snare with either. Yeah, this shielding is the. Yeah, that's your thing, let it open it. The snakes can run the concert, even when they stand next to yes, they open the. Self the water here, old but the name, not of missionary, really millimeters, yes, the no mouse, the nozzle, everything else, all of that. I'm the ship's nurse, the three was sick. Her mom sock enough. Slow birthness, and do mercy, she's doing. Healy, your needle, say, her mom socket. What, whoops, it doing. So, yeah. Yeah, outside so attention in lab out. Slow down to them. Initiate, and the fish, and your fish deserve them sour and the sheriff said that was there from one of your heads and measure of roll. So let's get see down Disney. Fine, I see down there on it. Sales, we're still out here, we must listen to some. And I'm stressing it, and that's just need to see. Ja, als ik die al ben used to that. Nee, ik heb het laatste de dag dan misschien. Oh, het first dingetje. Nee, we dus nog net even slow, niet hoe ver die doen. Nou, shimps neerstellen. Heel wat nog staat, dus dit is echt zelf mee heel wat. Dus ik ga eens naar shimps neerstellen, ik ga eens slopen. Heel verbitten en dat zit dan uit die roll wat is de wijn. Hier zit het. Hier het zeil baby voor de boot was nog niet in de houden. Hier mijn zakenmachines neerst de raas hier wou de naar hier wou wel. Ja, ze doen net als je wou die dus ik ben er wel. Oh, that's the wonderful. I'm the ship next to this time to this like you know it just has gone. En nog zo zijn. En dan ga ik niet alles eerst weer gaan met het. Nee, ja, bijna we gaan zoomen eigenlijk. Was there. Eerst wat het rijden nog in het zaal is, ik doe iets niet aan me. Stop die boemies en we said wat het rijden nog in de shims next. Ja, dat is weer dat je zijn. Oh ja, wat al. Nou, we're not said this, then we net the surf the else come over in the suit. And so don't we're that in the else, so I don't know, we're sitting it's just got help. Man, yes, and the farm and the cat were getting no stupid man. Herring is the medical here, the middle and east fifth is this in it. He did it. That's mad baby, it's your salad, baby. But a little up the head. Men har almost actually we're now we finished alright so we do we this second. Okay, but that's just happy now early here we're and all parts of the self is the guys in the ship next guy yeah. Also level up. Toen we remember. I go listen to it's and it's close. I'm not going to say. You're relaxing, it goes. You're meaning notes to get them today. Missions and there's snow's near. Why, dare say up in the first thing, I'll just scratch these. So, we're standing top, say, looks. There. You see that even in the Asher for it. Girl, got that lucky shit, yes, yeah, with the red. Her with the Asher for the Asher right now. Snatch. That's Errol trying to move and that's the line through it. It's half full of growth down. They said the full strain is you duck meal. Hurry, then. No, plus you're not a part of the again. And I end up eating it after this. Oh, tonight sounds like a big snowy hammer. Zelf mee, het zit weer gedaan, je weet nog sneller wat op die manier. Sloopbol, schijnt de stick, slaan dat sneller. Je op zelf mee zit, heel waarschijnlijk, nee.
Okay, so giving her another shot with the longer socket. may also help you to have some kind of a wobbly attachment, depending on how tight your extension is. Looks like I can do it this way, I just need to turn it over.
It looks like what works is a short extension. All right. There we go. Well, there's our exhaust reinstalled. Then I'm going to redo this little clip here to make sure the two halves of the transmission cooler lines are held together. And we're going to move back to do the transmission support bracket.
See, you know what I'm in? Yeah, we're almost there. Fun to get that. Oh, but no, we. Well, there's this thing, isn't it, mate? Just go out. Sit.
There's no shame there, she mustn't wear her old. But in the S-Bahns there.